The billionaire's leather briefcase slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy, hollow thud. But he didn't look down. He didn't even notice the millions of dollars in unsigned contracts scattering across the room. Julian Sinclair's breath was trapped tight in his throat, his chest locking up as if his heart had suddenly forgotten how to beat. He just stared. There, in the center of the sunlit playroom, stood his 4-year-old daughter, Clara. For 3 years, Clara's legs had been completely lifeless, bound to a customized, high-tech motorized wheelchair that sat cold and empty in the corner of the room. The doctors, the most expensive specialists money could buy, had all shaken their heads, calling her paralysis permanent. Yet, there she was. Clara was standing. Her tiny, trembling feet were planted flat on the plush white rug. Her small hand was wrapped tightly around the fingers of Cora, the quiet housemaid who wore simple yellow rubber cleaning gloves and a faded apron. Cora's eyes were glistening with tears, but her face was calm. "Look, Daddy," Clara whispered. The girl's voice was small, rusty from years of silence, but it cut through the massive mansion like a thunderclap. "I can stand." Julian tried to take a step forward, but his legs felt like lead. His mind raced back to just 40 minutes ago, when he was nothing more than a ruthless businessman running himself to the grave, entirely blind to the miracle that was about to unfold under his own roof. The rain in Chicago did not fall in gentle drops. It drove against the tinted glass of the custom black limousine in heavy, drumming sheets. Outside, the city was a smear of blurry headlights and towering, dark skyscrapers lost in the autumn fog. Inside the cabin of the car, however, the temperature was a perfect, sterile 68 degrees, smelling of expensive leather and old money. Julian Sinclair sat in the back, his face illuminated by the cold, blue glare of a tablet computer. To the public, Julian was an untouchable titan. At 38, he was the chief executive of Sinclair Developments, a real estate empire built on the aggressive acquisition of older, historical neighborhoods. Julian's philosophy was simple: tear down the old, the weak, and the historical, and replace them with gleaming towers of steel, concrete, and high-priced glass. He was a man who did not understand the concept of compromise. He demanded absolute obedience from his employees, absolute perfection from his projects, and absolute control over his emotions. But tonight, his body was refusing to obey. A sharp, hot tightness had settled right behind his ribs. It felt as if a heavy steel band was slowly being tightened around his chest, squeezing his lungs and making every breath shallow and difficult. He reached up, his fingers trembling slightly as he loosened the knot of his silk tie, but the pressure remained. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to ignore the dull, radiating ache creeping down his left shoulder. Mr. Sinclair, his driver, Marcus, spoke softly, his eyes meeting Julian's in the rearview mirror. "You look incredibly pale. The weather on Lakeshore Drive is getting worse, and the traffic is backing up. Perhaps we should bypass the estate and head straight to the private clinic? Dr. Aris is still on call." "No," Julian muttered, his voice cold, flat, and final. He did not look up from the tablet. "Keep driving to the house. I have exactly 3 hours to review the final Southside acquisition contracts before the midnight deadline. If the signatures are not transmitted to London by 12, the foreign investors will pull out, and we lose the entire block on 47th Street. I don't have time to be sick, Marcus." "Yes, sir," Marcus murmured, his tone laced with quiet, helpless worry as he turned the heavy car onto the rain-slicked highway. Julian closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the leather headrest. The pulsing noise of the windshield wipers, swipe, 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 sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of his life. He hated the silence of the car. The silence was dangerous. Whenever the noise of the business world faded, the memories would crawl out from the dark corners of his mind, clawing their way to the surface. 3 years ago, his life had been noisy in the best possible way. The Sinclair mansion had been filled with warmth, music, and the bright, melodic laughter of his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn was an artist, a woman who looked at the world not through the lens of profit margins, but through the lens of human emotion. She had spent her weekends volunteering at local shelters, painting murals on the walls of community centers, and reminding Julian that there was a world of beauty outside his corporate boardrooms. And then there was Clara. She was their miracle baby, born with her mother's bright green eyes and a laugh that could instantly melt Julian's cold exterior. Clara had just taken her very first, clumsy steps, her tiny hands gripping Julian's fingers as she wobbled across the living room rug, giggling with pure delight. But on a rainy night exactly like this one, the music had stopped forever. Julian had been driving. He had been in a hurry, his mind half focused on a business call, his hands tense on the steering wheel as he argued with the supplier. He had looked down at his phone for a single second, just to read a text message about a concrete shipment. That second was all it took. The delivery truck in front of them had hydroplaned on the black ice. Julian had slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The sound of the crash, the horrific, screeching tear of metal, the explosive pop of the airbags, and the terrifying, sudden silence that followed, was a recording that played constantly in the back of his mind, night after night. Evelyn had died before the paramedics could even cut her from the wreckage. Clara had survived, but her tiny, fragile spine had been badly crushed by the impact. The doctors at the pediatric hospital had delivered a devastating verdict that broke whatever was left of Julian's heart. The nerve damage is complete. The girl will never walk again. The guilt had settled into Julian's chest, growing heavier, colder, and more suffocating with every passing year. He couldn't bear to look at Clara. Every time he saw his daughter's green eyes, he saw Evelyn's face. He saw his own hand reaching for the phone. He saw the mistake that had ruined his family. Unable to face his own shame, Julian had done what he did best. He tried to buy his way out of the tragedy. He spent millions turning the entire west wing of the mansion into a state-of-the-art physical therapy clinic. He hired the most expensive private pediatric specialists, imported advanced robotic gait training equipment from Germany, and offered private nurses salaries that were triple the industry standard. But money could not buy back Clara's spirit. Traumatized by the crash and the sudden loss of her mother, Clara had retreated into a silent, locked world. She stopped speaking. She refused to participate in the painful, exhausting physical therapy sessions. She would sit in her motorized wheelchair, her small body limp, her eyes vacant as she stared out the tall windows of her playroom at the cold waters of Lake Michigan. Eventually, Julian stopped going into the playroom. It hurt too much. He convinced himself that by working 18-hour days, by building a massive financial empire, he was securing Clara's future. He left the daily care of his daughter entirely to a rotating door of hired nurses. But none of them lasted. They complained that Clara was unresponsive and impossible to manage. Until Cora Jenkins arrived. Cora did not have a degree from an Ivy League university, nor did she possess certifications in robotic physical therapy. She was a quiet, middle-aged woman from the south side of Chicago who had spent her life working in community health clinics and caring for elderly relatives. When Julian's assistant had first brought her application to his desk 6 months ago, Julian had tried to dismiss her immediately. "She's underqualified," Mr. Sinclair, his assistant, had noted. "She has no experience with advanced pediatric rehabilitation." But Julian had noticed a handwritten letter attached to her resume. It didn't list accolades or salary demands. It simply read, "A child who has lost her mother does not need to be fixed by machines. She needs to be loved by a human being." Too exhausted to argue with another agency, Julian had hired her on a 1-week trial. Within days, Cora had quietly dismantled the clinical atmosphere of the West Wing. She packed the cold, metal therapy machines into the closets and locked the doors. She brought in soft, colorful quilts, handmade wooden toys, and a quiet, unhurried peace that the mansion had desperately lacked. She did not force Clara to stand. She did not lecture her or run her through repetitive vocal exercises. Instead, she simply sat on the floor next to her wheelchair. Every afternoon, Cora would bring in a large wooden bowl of warm water and lavender soap. She would gently lift Clara's cold, lifeless feet, place them into the water, and massage the tight, atrophied muscles of her calves with her warm, bare hands. While she worked, she would sing soft, old lullabies, her voice rich and comforting in the quiet room. She talked to her as if she were fully capable of understanding every word, telling her stories about her own childhood, about the strength of her ancestors, and about the beautiful world that lay beyond the mansion's steel gates. Julian had watched her once, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. He had expected Clara to pull away, to retreat further into her shell. But she hadn't. Clara had looked down at Cora's hands, hands that were rough from years of hard work, but gentler than anything Clara had ever felt. A tiny, fragile tear had rolled down her small cheek, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara's tiny fingers had reached out and lightly touched the sleeve of Cora's faded blue apron. Still, Julian had kept his distance. He paid Cora a generous salary, but he treated her as a mere employee. He could not bring himself to step into the warmth of that playroom. To feel happy, to feel hope, felt like a betrayal of Evelyn's memory. Returning to the light. The limousine came to a smooth, silent stop under the grand stone portico of the Sinclair estate. Marcus quickly stepped out, opening the door and holding a large black umbrella over Julian's head as he stepped into the damp, cool night air. As Julian's feet touched the wet stone, a sudden wave of intense dizziness washed over him. The world seemed to tilt, and a sharp, hot needle of pain shot down his left arm, making his fingers go completely numb. He had to grip the heavy frame of the car door tightly to keep his knees from buckling. "Sir?" Marcus asked, his face tightening with genuine alarm. "You're trembling. Let me help you inside." "I don't need help, Marcus," Julian snapped, his voice tight as he forced himself to stand straight, pulling his arm away. "Get the car cleaned. I won't be needing you again until tomorrow morning." He turned and walked up the grand stone steps, his heavy leather briefcase clutched in his right hand. He pushed open the massive, double oak doors of the mansion, stepping into the quiet, warm foyer. The air inside was still, smelling faintly of the lavender soap Cora used and the clean, fresh scent of the rain outside. He checked his gold watch. It was 8:15 p.m. He had exactly 3 hours and 45 minutes to finalize the Southside contracts. He walked toward the grand, sweeping marble staircase, intending to go straight to his third-floor study, lock the door, and bury himself in the work. He did not want to see his daughter. He did not want to face the empty wheelchair. But as he passed the arched entryway of the playroom, he caught a glimpse of golden light spilling across the hallway floor. Clara was usually in bed by 8 p.m. Julian frowned, his chest tightening once again as a sharp, squeezing pressure made it difficult to draw a breath. He stopped in his tracks, intending to call out for Cora, to demand to know why his daughter was not asleep, why the strict schedule was not being followed. He stepped into the doorway, and that was when the billionaire froze. The heavy leather briefcase slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy, hollow thud. But he didn't look down. He didn't even notice the millions of dollars in unsigned contracts scattering across the room. The silence in the playroom was heavy, almost sacred, broken only by the soft, rhythmic patter of the rain beating against the massive arched windows. Julian Sinclair stood paralyzed in the doorway, his leather briefcase lying forgotten on the polished floor. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his feet. Every logical, calculating circuit in his brilliant business mind had shut down, leaving only a raw, overwhelming disbelief. There she was, his daughter, Clara. Her tiny, pale legs, which had been as limp and lifeless as winter branches for 3 long years, were planted firmly on the thick, white wool rug. Her knees trembled, shaking under the unfamiliar strain of gravity, but they held. Her small, delicate hand was gripped tightly around the calloused, damp fingers of Cora, who knelt beside her like a protective guardian. Cora's yellow rubber cleaning gloves glistened in the soft golden light of the floor lamps. A tear had escaped her eye, tracing a clean path through the light dusting of wood polish on her cheek, but her posture remained completely steady. She was Clara's anchor, absorbing the child's trembling fear and offering pure, silent strength in return. "Clara," Julian's voice was a ragged whisper, barely escaping his tight throat. "Look, Daddy," Clara repeated. Her voice was thin, fragile, and raspy from years of near-total muteness, but to Julian, it sounded like a symphony. Her bright green eyes, so strikingly like her mother's, shined with a mixture of terror and pure, triumphant joy. I'm standing." Cora held my hand, and I didn't fall. Julian took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug. His heart was hammering violently against his ribs, not with the dull, aching pressure from earlier, but with a sudden, explosive surge of adrenaline. He wanted to run to her, to throw his arms around her, to weep into her soft brown curls. But he stopped himself, terrified that even a sudden gust of air might shatter the fragile miracle before his eyes and send her tumbling back into the cold, metal cage of her wheelchair. How? Julian breathed, his gaze shifting from his daughter's face down to her feet, then slowly up to Cora. How is this possible? The specialists, Dr. Vance, they said the nerve pathways were entirely severed. They said it was a biological impossibility. Cora looked up at the billionaire. Her expression was devoid of triumph or smugness. There was only a deep, soulful exhaustion and an infinite tenderness. Your specialist looked at her spine through machines, Mr. Sinclair, Cora said softly, her voice carrying the gentle, rolling cadence of the South Side neighborhood she called home. They saw broken bone and scarred tissue, but they didn't look at her heart. They didn't see the fear holding her captive. Clara didn't need her nerves rewired. She needed to know she was safe enough to try. For the past 6 months, while Julian had been locked away in high-rise boardrooms negotiating hostile takeovers and signing multi-million-dollar demolition contracts, a quiet revolution had been taking place in the west wing of his mansion. Cora had realized early on that Clara's paralysis was not merely physical, it was deeply psychological. The trauma of the car accident, the sudden, violent loss of her mother, the terrifying roar of tearing metal, and the subsequent coldness of her grieving father had locked Clara's mind in a state of permanent survival. Her body had shut down its motor functions as a way to keep her still, safe, and hidden from a world that had suddenly become incredibly hostile. While the highly paid physical therapists had tried to force Clara's limbs into compliance using heavy steel braces, electric muscle simulators, and robotic harnesses, Cora had taken a completely different path. Every single afternoon, Cora would wheel Clara over to the large bay window overlooking the gardens. She would pull up a low wooden stool, fill a large ceramic bowl with warm water, and add drops of lavender and chamomile oil. Then, she would perform a ritual of pure, unconditional devotion. Cora would gently lift Clara's tiny, pale feet and place them into the warm, fragrant water. With her bare hands, she would massage the stiff, cold muscles of Clara's calves and thighs. But she didn't just massage them, she spoke to them. "Wake up, sweet little toes," Cora would whisper, her voice a soothing, rhythmic hum. "The grass is waiting for you. The autumn leaves want to dance with you. You don't have to be afraid of the ground. The earth is strong, and it will hold you up." As she worked, Cora would tell Clara stories. She didn't tell fairy tales about princesses waiting in towers. She told stories of real people. She told her about her grandmother, who had walked 20 miles a day to work in the cotton fields of Mississippi to put her children through school. She told her about the children in her South Side neighborhood who played basketball on cracked asphalt with milk crates for hoops, finding joy in the middle of concrete jungles. For months, Clara had remained silent, but her eyes had begun to follow Cora's every move. The breakthrough had happened just 3 days prior. As Cora was drying Clara's feet with a soft, warm towel, Clara had suddenly reached out her hand and gripped Cora's thumb. Her grip was weak, but her green eyes were intense, searching Cora's face for something she hadn't seen in her father's eyes for 3 years: hope. "Cora," Clara had whispered, speaking her very first word in 36 months. "Can we try?" They didn't use the braces. They didn't use the high-tech walkers. Instead, Cora had stood Clara up on her own bed, letting the soft mattress support her weight while Cora held her hands. Day by day, inch by inch, they moved from the bed to the floor, until finally, on this rainy Tuesday evening, Clara had found the strength to stand flat on the playroom rug. Julian took another step, his knees trembling almost as much as his daughter's. He fell to his knees on the plush rug, his expensive tailored trousers soaking up the residual dampness of the room, though he didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, he was looking at his daughter not with guilt, not with the agonizing shadow of his deceased wife, but with pure, unfiltered love. "Clara," he choked out, reaching his trembling hands toward her. "My sweet girl." Clara's face lit up. She took a tiny, wobbly step forward, her very first independent step since the night of the crash. Her foot planted flat on the wool fibers. But the physical exertion was too much. Her tiny thigh muscles gave out, and she began to tilt forward. Julian lunged, catching her in his arms before she could touch the floor. He pulled her tiny body against his chest, holding her so tightly that he could feel the rapid, frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. Her tears wet his collar, but Julian was already weeping silently, his shoulders shaking as the thick, icy wall of grief around his heart finally began to crack and shatter. "I've got you," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. "I've got you, Clara. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I missed you, Daddy," Clara sobbed, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his soft wool sweater. "I wanted to walk so you wouldn't be sad anymore. I wanted to make the boo-boo go away." Her words were a beautiful, agonizing dagger to his soul. She had done this for him. While he had been hiding in his corporate towers, trying to run away from his own guilt, his 4-year-old daughter had been fighting a silent, heroic battle just to heal his broken heart. Cora stood up slowly, her yellow gloves making a soft, squeaking sound as she pulled them off her hands. She stepped back, giving the father and daughter the space they had desperately needed for 3 years. Her face was peaceful, her chest rising and falling in a quiet sigh of relief. But the moment of pure joy was short-lived. As Julian held his daughter, the sharp, hot pressure behind his ribs suddenly flared into a blinding, white-hot agony. It felt as if an iron hand had reached inside his chest, grabbed his heart, and squeezed it with a brutal, crushing force. The breath was instantly knocked from his lungs. His vision went blurry, the bright, warm colors of the playroom spinning into a dizzying vortex of gray and black. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead, and his left arm grew entirely numb, feeling like a heavy, useless weight attached to his shoulder. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of intense pain escaping his lips. His grip on Clara loosened, his arms losing their strength. "Daddy?" Clara asked, pulling back slightly. Her green eyes widened with instant terror as she saw her father's face. Julian was gray, his lips turning a faint shade of blue, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Julian tried to speak, to reassure her, to tell her that he was fine, but no sound came out. He could only draw shallow, desperate gasps of air. He rolled onto his side, his body collapsing onto the plush rug beside his daughter's wheelchair. "Mr. Sinclair." Cora's voice shattered the room's quiet peace. She dropped her gloves and rushed forward, her calm demeanor vanishing, replaced by the sharp, decisive instinct of a seasoned caregiver. She knelt beside Julian, immediately placing 2 fingers against the side of his neck. His pulse was chaotic, racing at a terrifying speed before dropping to a faint, sluggish flutter. Julian lay on his back, his hand clutching desperately at his chest. Through the dark, closing tunnel of his vision, he saw Clara sitting on the floor beside him, her face pale, her hands covering her mouth as she began to sob. "Clara, look at me," Cora said, her voice commanding but incredibly calm as she leaned over Julian. "Look at Cora, sweetie. I need you to be very brave right now. Your daddy is having a hard time breathing, and I need to help him. I want you to crawl over to the corner, near your toy box, and close your eyes. Can you do that for me?" "Daddy," Clara wailed, her tiny hand reaching out to touch Julian's cold cheek. "I've got him, Clara," Cora promised, her voice unwavering. "But I need you to be safe. Go to the toy box, sweetie. Now." Clara, terrified but trusting Cora implicitly, dragged herself backward across the rug, her eyes locked on her father's face. Cora didn't waste a single second. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out her mobile phone, and dialed 911. "I need an advanced life support ambulance immediately at 1400 Lakeshore Drive," Cora said, her voice steady and clear as she monitored Julian's fading vitals. "Male, 38 years old, presenting with acute myocardial infarction. He is conscious but rapidly deteriorating. He has crushing chest pain radiating to the left arm, diaphoresis, and cyanosis around the lips. His pulse is thready and irregular." She listened to the dispatcher for a brief second. "Yes, the gates are open. I will have the security staff guide you directly to the West Wing. Please hurry." She ended the call, tossing the phone onto the rug. She looked down at Julian. His eyes were wide with a terrifying, primal panic. He was suffocating, his lungs desperately trying to draw oxygen from the air, but his heart was failing to pump the blood. "Listen to me, Julian," Cora said, using his first name for the very first time. She took his cold, clammy hand in her warm, firm grip. You are having a heart attack. Your body is in shock. But you are not going to die tonight. Do you hear me? Your daughter just stood up for you. She needs her father. You have to fight. Julian's fingers tightened weakly around hers. The pain in his chest was a roaring fire, consuming everything. He looked past Cora, his eyes finding Clara huddled by the toy box, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. Not like this, Julian thought, his mind screaming against the darkness. Please, God, not like this. I just got her back. I just held her. Don't let me leave her alone in this cold house. Keep breathing, Julian, Cora commanded, her hands moving to the collar of his shirt, tearing open the top buttons to give his chest room to expand. Focus on my voice. Slow, shallow breaths. Don't fight the air. Let it come. But the darkness was too heavy. The sound of the rain outside seemed to grow louder, a deafening, chaotic roar that filled his ears, gradually drowning out Cora's voice. The warm golden light of the playroom began to fade, replaced by a cold, quiet gray mist. Through the mist, Julian heard the distant, echoing wail of an approaching siren, its high-pitched scream cutting through the Chicago night. And then, his heart gave one final, erratic flutter and stopped. Julian's eyes rolled back, his head falling limply to the side as his hand slipped from Cora's grip, hitting the plush white rug with a quiet, devastating finality. Cora didn't panic. She didn't scream. With a fierce, protective determination, she slid onto her knees directly over Julian's chest. She locked her fingers together, placed the heel of her hand on the center of his breastbone, and leaned forward, using her entire body weight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The thuds of her compressions began, keeping time against the drumbeat of the rain outside, fighting to drag the billionaire back from the edge of the grave. The rhythmic, heavy thuds of Cora's chest compressions echoed through the vast, empty playroom of the Sinclair mansion, keeping time against the frantic drumbeat of the rain against the glass. Her hands, calloused from years of honest labor and gentle care, pressed down with a precise, unyielding force on Julian's breastbone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stay with me, Julian, she whispered, her brow beaded with sweat. Your daughter is watching. Don't you dare close your eyes. In the corner of the room, huddled by the toy box, Clara sat on the floor, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her tear-filled green eyes locked onto her father's pale face. She didn't cry out anymore. She was completely silent, frozen in a terrifyingly familiar state of shock. Suddenly, the heavy, double-oak doors of the mansion were pushed open with a sharp, violent force down the hall. The damp, cold autumn air rushed into the warm foyer, carrying with it the smell of wet pavement and ozone, spilling all the way into the playroom. But it wasn't the paramedics. 3 men in sharp, expensive charcoal gray suits stepped into the playroom, their leather shoes clicking loudly on the polished wood border surrounding the white rug. At the head of the group was Richard Vance, Julian's chief legal counsel and the deputy director of Sinclair Developments. He was a tall, lean man with sharp, avian features and silver hair that remained perfectly in place despite the wind howling outside. He carried a sleek, heavy leather portfolio under his arm, his face set in a grim, determined scowl. What in God's name is happening here? Richard demanded, his voice slicing through the quiet mansion like a razor. He stopped dead in his tracks as his eyes traveled from the scattered contracts on the floor to the sight of Julian lying limp, his shirt torn open, with the housemaid kneeling over him. Get away from him, Richard snapped, stepping forward and waving his hand dismissively toward Cora, as if she were an intrusive stray animal. Who authorized you to touch him? Security, remove this woman immediately. The 2 imposing, broad-shouldered security guards who had entered behind Richard took a step forward, their faces expressionless, their hands moving toward their waistbands. Cora didn't stop her compressions. She threw her weight into her hands, pressing down on Julian's chest with a fierce, rhythmic determination. I am his daughter's primary caregiver, and he is in cardiac arrest. Cora shouted back, her voice carrying a deep, resonant authority that made the security guards hesitate. If you touch me, or if you force me to stop before the paramedics get here, his brain will be starved of oxygen in 3 minutes. Do you want to explain to the board of directors why you killed your CEO? Richard's eyes narrowed, his gaze falling to the scattered papers on the floor, the South Side acquisition documents that Julian was supposed to have signed. He checked his gold wristwatch. It was 8:32 p.m. The London consortium was expecting the digital signatures by midnight, but the internal board meeting to finalize the transition of power in case of a delay was scheduled in exactly 28 minutes. He needs to sign the land transfer, Richard muttered, his voice cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of human empathy. He looked at Julian's pale, clammy face, then back at Clara. The company is at a critical juncture. Millions of dollars, entire developments, depend on his authorization tonight. We have a private, state-of-the-art medical suite at our corporate headquarters. We can transport him there in the SUV. He can be stabilized by our private physicians, sign the digital documents, and then be taken to a hospital. Are you completely out of your mind? Clara gasped, her hands still pushing down on Julian's chest, her muscles burning from the physical strain. He is medically unstable. His heart is in a chaotic rhythm. If you lift him, if you move him down those steps without a defibrillator and in 4-line, his heart will stop completely before you even close the car door. This isn't a corporate negotiation, you fool. This is a man's life. Richard stepped closer, his face hardening into a mask of pure corporate arrogance. He looked down at Clara, his eyes dripping with disdain. Listen to me, Maid, Richard whispered, his voice low and dangerous. You scrub his floors and you watch his sick kid. You do not understand the scale of what is happening here. If Sinclair Developments falls tonight, thousands of people lose their jobs, and billions of dollars in assets vanish. Julian Sinclair is a cog in a massive machine. The machine does not stop because he has a weak heart. Move aside, or my men will physically throw you out of this house. The two security guards closed the distance, their large hands reaching out to grab Cora's shoulders. Cora's eyes flashed with a protective, maternal fury. She stopped her compressions for a split second, stood up to her full, modest height, and stepped directly between the guards and Julian's helpless body. She raised her bare hands, wet with sweat, her posture as unyielding as an iron gate. If you lay a single finger on me, Clara bellowed, her voice shaking the crystal chandelier above them, I will make sure the police, the press, and every news outlet in this city knows that you forced a medical caregiver off a dying man to protect a real estate deal. I will make sure you are charged with depraved heart murder. Now step back, or so help me God, I will tear you apart myself. For a tense, breathless second, Richard Vance blinked, completely stunned. He had spent his entire life intimidating city officials, tenants, and rival executives, but he had never encountered a force like the quiet, middle-aged woman standing before him. The sheer, protective power radiating from Clara was terrifyingly absolute. Before Richard could recover his composure, the grand oak doors of the mansion burst open once again. This time, 3 paramedics in dark blue uniforms rushed into the playroom, carrying a heavy orange trauma bag, a portable defibrillator, and a folding gurney. 911 call for a cardiac arrest. The lead paramedic, a burly man with a thick mustache, shouted as he assessed the room in a single glance. Everyone who isn't medical, clear the area immediately. Back up. Richard Vance tried to step in, flashing his corporate ID card. Excuse me, officer. I am Mr. Sinclair's legal representative. We have a private medical transport ready. I don't care if you're the governor, sir. The paramedic barked, pushing past Richard so hard the lawyer stumbled backward into his security guards. Obstructing emergency services is a federal offense. Move. The paramedics knelt beside Julian, immediately taking over. Cora stepped back, her chest heaving as she ran her hand through her hair, her eyes immediately seeking out Clara. She walked back to the toy box, kneeling on the rug and pulling the trembling little girl into her arms. She buried Clara's face in her shoulder, shielding her from the sight of the paramedics ripping open Julian's fine shirt, attaching the white adhesive defibrillator pads, and shouting commands over his limp body. We have a shockable rhythm, the paramedic called out, his fingers flying over the screen of the cardiac monitor. Charging to 200 joules. Everyone clear. A loud, high-pitched whine filled the room, followed by a sudden, heavy thud as Julian's body jolted off the floor, his muscles contracting violently under the electrical current. In the dark, quiet void of his mind, Julian felt a sudden, searing bolt of white-hot lightning. The image of Clara standing beside Cora flashed before his eyes, a beacon of pure, golden light in the cold gray fog of his memories. "Daddy, please don't leave me." His heart, which had been fluttering uselessly like a dying leaf, suddenly caught the rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. "We have sinus rhythm," the paramedic yelled, a note of relief in his voice. "Let's get him on the gurney. We need to move now." Richard Vance watched from the doorway, his hands clenched into tight fists as the paramedics wheeled Julian out into the pouring rain. He looked at the scattered contracts on the floor, then at Cora, who was gently carrying Clara out of the playroom. "This isn't over, Cora," Richard muttered, his voice cold. "The board will take control of this company by morning, and you will be the first person fired from this estate." Cora stopped, holding Clara tightly against her chest. She looked at the powerful lawyer with a quiet, devastating pity. "You can take his buildings, Mr. Vance," Cora said softly, "but you can't take his soul. And tonight, he finally remembered he has one." The private intensive care unit on the 6th floor of Chicago Memorial Hospital was a landscape of sterile whites, chrome rails, and the low, persistent hum of life support machinery. The air was cold, smelling heavily of bleach and rubbing alcohol. Julian Sinclair lay in the center of the room, looking incredibly small beneath the thin hospital sheets. A thick plastic tube ran from his mouth to a ventilator, which rose and fell with a rhythmic, mechanical hiss. Lines snaked from bags of clear fluid into the back of his pale, bruised hands, and a line of colorful waves flickered across the cardiac monitor above his bed. Outside the glass partition, the hospital corridors were quiet, the midnight shift change having long since passed. In the corner of the room, sitting in a stiff vinyl armchair, was Cora. She had been sitting there for 5 hours, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes never leaving Julian's face. She had refused to leave, even when the head nurse had politely informed her that only immediate family was allowed in the ICU. "I am the only family he has here right now," Cora had said, her voice quiet but carrying that same unshakable strength. The nurse, seeing the raw, protective devotion in Cora's eyes, had quietly closed the curtain and walked away. Clara was asleep in the pediatric waiting lobby downstairs, wrapped in Cora's warm wool coat, with Marcus, the loyal driver, keeping a protective watch over her. Julian's mind was not quiet. He was trapped in a vivid, shifting dreamscape, a world of thick gray fog and the endless, metallic screech of tires. He was back in the car. The rain was drumming on the windshield, a deafening, chaotic roar. He looked to his right, and there was Evelyn, her face soft and beautiful, smiling at him. "Julian, look at the road," she whispered. He looked down at his lap. His phone was glowing with a red notification. "A $3 million steel shipment is delayed." "Julian, please," Evelyn urged, her voice growing distant, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. He reached for the phone. He swiped the screen. And then, the world tilted. The headlights of the oncoming truck blinded him, two massive, white-hot suns that filled his vision. The sound of tearing metal exploded in his ears, a horrific, crushing weight that pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. He was pinned beneath the steering wheel, unable to move, unable to breathe. He looked into the back seat. Clara's pink blanket was covered in glass. "It's your fault," a voice whispered in the dark. It sounded like his own voice, but colder, harsher. "You killed her. You broke your daughter. You tried to buy your way out of the blood, Julian. But you can't buy forgiveness." Julian struggled against the weight, his chest burning, his lungs pleading for air. He wanted to scream, to apologize, to tear his own skin off if it would bring Evelyn back. He was sinking into the dark, wet asphalt, the cold water rising over his mouth, pulling him down into the quiet, absolute silence of the grave. But then, a warm, soft hand touched his face. The hand didn't smell of leather or expensive cologne. It smelled of lavender, soap, and clean, rain-washed air. "Julian," a voice called out. It wasn't Evelyn's voice, and it wasn't the harsh, accusing voice of his guilt. It was Cora's. "Your daughter is standing by the window. She is waiting for you to walk with her. Don't you dare close your eyes." Through the dark water, Julian saw a tiny, golden light. He reached out with his numb, broken fingers, struggling against the current, dragging himself upward, inch by painful inch, toward the surface. In the hospital room, Julian's eyelids fluttered. A low, raspy groan escaped his throat, fighting against the plastic tube of the ventilator. The heart monitor's steady beep, 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 suddenly quickened. Cora stood up instantly, walking to the side of the bed. She gently took his cold hand in her warm ones, leaning down close to his ear. "Julian," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce hope. "I'm right here. Clara is safe. She is waiting for you. Come back to us." Julian's eyes slowly cracked open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU making his pupils contract. He looked at the white ceiling, then at the 4 lines, and finally, his gaze settled on Cora. He tried to speak, his lips moving silently around the plastic tube. "Shoo! Don't try to talk," Cora said gently, using a soft cloth to wipe a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "The doctors had to help you breathe, but you're stable now. The blockage is gone. You're safe." Julian closed his eyes, a single, heavy tear escaping from the corner of his eye and dampening the white pillow. He squeezed Cora's hand with his weak, trembling fingers. He was alive, and for the first time in 3 years, the heavy, suffocating weight of the guilt in his chest felt a little lighter. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a cold, clear blue sky. The autumn sun poured through the large window of the private ICU room, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. The ventilator had been removed, replaced by a simple oxygen mask that sat over Julian's nose and mouth. He was sitting up slightly, his face still pale but carrying a faint, healthy color. Clara was sitting on the edge of his bed, her small hand wrapped tightly around his thumb. She was eating a piece of dry toast Cora had brought her, her green eyes bright as she looked at her father. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice still small but steady. "The doctor said you have a boo-boo on your heart." Julian smiled, a genuine, soft expression that completely transformed his face. He lifted his hand, gently brushing a soft brown curl away from her forehead. "I do, sweetie," Julian said, his voice raspy and deep. "But the doctors fixed it. And seeing you stand up yesterday, that made my heart feel much better." "I did it for you, Daddy," Clara said simply, her innocent words cutting straight through Julian's chest like a warm knife. "I wanted to help you." Before Julian could reply, the heavy wooden door of the ICU room swung open with a sharp, arrogant force. Richard Vance stepped into the room, followed by 3 older men in identical, expensive navy blue suits, the executive committee of Sinclair Developments. Richard had a tablet in his hand, his face set in a grim, determined expression. He didn't look at Clara, and he didn't look at Cora, who was standing quietly by the window. "Julian," Richard said, his voice tight and formal. "I'm glad to see you are awake. But we have an emergency. The London Consortium has officially withdrawn their funds. The Southside acquisition has stalled, and the press has found out about your collapse. Our stock is down 7% in pre-market trading." Julian looked at his chief legal counsel, feeling a sudden, profound sense of disgust. This was the man he had spent 10 years working with, a man who saw a human life as nothing more than a variable on a spreadsheet. "The stock will recover, Richard," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "Not without a showing of decisive leadership, it won't," Richard snapped, stepping to the foot of the bed and holding out the digital tablet. "The board has convened an emergency session. We have drafted a temporary transfer of executive authority to myself, pending your recovery. We also need you to sign the emergency authorization to bypass the city's zoning laws and begin demolition on the South Side block immediately. It's the only way to reassure the investors." Julian looked at the tablet, then at the 3 board members, who stood in the background like silent, gray vultures waiting for a carcass to clear. "And the community center?" Julian asked. "Julian, this is madness," Richard shouted, his professional composure cracking. "You are throwing away a $300 million project. The board will have you removed for incompetence." "Let them try," Julian said, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous, quiet fire that made Richard take a half step back. "My father built this company on concrete and fear, Richard. But I am not my father. I spent 3 years trying to buy my way out of my own pain, trying to build towers high enough to hide from my guilt. But last night, my daughter took her very first steps because of love, not because of a bank account. And she did it while holding the hand of a woman who didn't ask me for a single dollar to care for her soul. Julian pointed toward the door. The Southside Community Center will not be demolished. In fact, Sinclair Developments will fund its complete renovation. We are going to build a state-of-the-art pediatric rehabilitation center right in the heart of that neighborhood, free of charge for any family who needs it. Now, get out of my room, Richard, before I have hospital security remove you for trespassing. Richard Vance stared at Julian, realizing for the first time that the cold, calculating tycoon he had controlled for a decade was gone forever. He slammed the tablet into his portfolio, turned on his heel, and marched out of the room, the 3 board members scurrying behind him like frightened mice. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving the room in a peaceful, golden silence. Cora walked slowly to the side of the bed, her eyes wet with tears, a beautiful, relieved smile on her face. "Thank you, Julian," she whispered. Julian reached out, taking her hand in his. "No, Cora. Thank you. For saving my life. And for showing me how to live it." 6 months later, the cold Chicago winter had given way to a vibrant, warm spring. The towering concrete skeleton of the South Side Development Project was gone, replaced instead by a bustling, sun-drenched construction site where the old brick community center stood proudly, its historic facade meticulously preserved. A large, polished brass sign near the entrance read, "The Evelyn Sinclair Community Pediatric Center." The street was alive with music, the smell of barbecue, and the laughter of neighborhood children playing on the newly paved sidewalk. Julian stood near the entrance of the half-renovated building, dressed in a simple button-down shirt with his sleeves rolled up, looking happier and healthier than he had in years. Beside him stood Marcus, who was smiling warmly as he watched the local kids run past. "She's ready, Mr. Sinclair," Marcus said softly, nodding toward the sleek black sedan parked at the curb. The rear door of the car opened, and Cora stepped out first. She wore a simple, elegant green dress, her hair pinned back, her eyes shining as she turned to help the passenger. But she didn't reach for a wheelchair. Instead, Clara stepped out of the car. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress and small, sturdy white orthopedic sneakers. She paused for a brief second, balancing herself on the running board, before her feet firmly met the pavement. Julian's breath caught in his throat. Even after months of watching her physical therapy sessions, the sight of his daughter, standing on her own 2 feet, still felt like a miracle. Cora took Clara's left hand, but as they reached the edge of the crowd, Clara gently pulled her hand away. "I want to walk to Daddy by myself," Clara said, her voice clear and filled with a proud, childlike determination. The bustling crowd of neighborhood residents slowly parted, sensing the gravity of the moment. A quiet, respectful hush fell over the street. Julian dropped to his knees on the concrete, his arms open wide, his eyes already sparkling with tears. Clara took a deep breath. She wobbled slightly on her left leg, but she stabilized herself. She took 1 step, then another. Her small hands were held out to her sides for balance, her face a picture of absolute concentration. 3 steps. 4 steps. 5. With a joyful, ringing laugh, Clara broke into a clumsy, triumphant run for the final yard, throwing herself directly into Julian's waiting arms. He caught her, lifting her high into the air as the entire neighborhood erupted into loud, heartfelt cheers and applause. Julian squeezed his daughter tight, burying his face in her shoulder as his tears finally spilled over. "I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud of you. I told you I'd walk with you, Daddy," Clara whispered into his ear. Julian set her down, keeping a steadying hand on her shoulder, and looked up at Cora. She was standing a few feet away, her hands clasped, watching them with a love so pure it filled the entire street. Julian stood up and walked over to her. He didn't care about the cameras, the remaining board members, or the reporters standing at the edge of the block. He reached out, gently taking Cora's hand, and pulled her into a warm, deeply grateful embrace. "Thank you for bringing us home, Cora," he murmured against her hair. "You did the hard work, Julian," she whispered back, leaning into his warmth. "You chose to open your heart. We build walls of concrete and glass to protect ourselves from the pain of the past. We convince ourselves that if we just build high enough, climb fast enough, and buy enough of the world, we can outrun our guilt. But true strength isn't built in a boardroom, and it can't be bought with $1 billion. It is found in the quiet courage of a woman who refuses to let a neighborhood die. It is found in the trembling legs of a little girl who just wanted her father to smile again. And it is found in the heart of a man who finally realized that the greatest step he could ever take was the one that brought him back down to earth.